A second autopsy came back this week, and it answered almost nothing. That's the strange part of this story. Not a shocking reveal, but the absence of one. Two separate medical examiners, working independently, looked at the same 18-year-old body and arrived at the same two words: undetermined, pending investigation. In true crime, silence like that usually means one of two things. Either the case is genuinely, mundanely simple, and the paperwork just hasn't caught up, or there's something underneath it that nobody has found the language for yet. Nolan Wells was 18 years old, a football player, the kind of kid his father says was already gearing up for practice in his head, even in the middle of summer. He wanted to be the best, his father would later say, because he wanted to make his parents proud. That's the version of Nolan that existed before July 4th. After July 4th, he becomes something else, a name attached to an open case, a face in a missing person's photo, and eventually a body on a beach that nobody can fully explain. The day itself started ordinarily enough. A boat pulled away from a dock in Mississippi mid-morning, carrying Nolan and a group of friends toward Horn Island, a barrier island 10 miles off the coast, empty of permanent residents, reachable only by water, and, on the 4th of July, absolutely packed with people celebrating. It's the kind of place regulars know well, a strip of sand and scrub brush that turns into an informal party for a few hours once a year. The boat arrived at the island a little after 11 in the morning. For the next several hours, nothing about the day stands out in anyone's account. Then, sometime around 3 in the afternoon, the story splits. According to the friends who were there, Nolan chose to stay behind. He'd been talking to a girl his friends refer to only as someone they didn't really know, and he told the group he'd catch up with them later, that he'd get back to the mainland on his own. So the boat left without him. That's the account investigators have been given. His parents don't buy it, not because they have evidence to contradict it, but because they know their son. Their son didn't do that, his father would insist. Nolan stayed with the group, every time, without exception.
I don't know why he would. We always taught him to, if you go with a group, you stay with a group.
It's a small detail, almost nothing on its own. But it's the kind of small detail that, once you sit with it, starts to feel like it's carrying more weight than it should. A pattern broken, with no one around to explain why. His mother reported him missing that night. A search began. The Coast Guard, Mississippi's Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service, and eventually a volunteer air search group called the United Cajun Navy, flying low over the island looking for any sign of him. For 2 days, that search covered a stretch of water and shoreline that isn't easy to search in the first place. Horn Island is roughly 10 miles long, ringed by shifting sandbars, and the currents around it are known locally for pulling in directions that surprise people who don't spend their lives on that water. Search crews flew grid patterns for hours at a stretch, working off a description built from the last photographs anyone had of him. Swim trunks, no shirt, last seen standing on the sand a little after 3 in the afternoon. Everyone involved understood, by the second day, which of the two likely outcomes was becoming more probable. Then, on the northwestern tip of the island, a volunteer air crew spotted something from altitude. Law enforcement boats converging on a single point of shoreline, and, once they descended and circled for a closer look, a body at the waterline. A body, face down, wearing only swim trunks, no shirt, no shoes. Dental records would later confirm what everyone already suspected. That should have been the point where the story started to close. Instead, it's the point where it opened up.
And so narrative matters in this case. And we're saying that in Nolan Wells' situation, the narrative should not be it was an accident before there was an investigation. The narrative should not be the words of individuals who went on a boat to the island with him, but they came without him, but with his cell phone, and you don't investigate those individuals.
That's the kind of gap this case keeps circling back to. Official words that don't match physical facts, and no one yet able to say why. It's exactly the kind of unresolved thread the fatal truth exists to sit with until it makes sense, instead of moving on the moment the headlines do. If you want to stay for the parts of this case nobody else is slowing down to explain, subscribe now and follow this investigation as it develops. The official autopsy was performed by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office the day after the body was recovered. Under ordinary circumstances, a family waits for that report and it tells them, eventually, what happened. Here, the report simply didn't come. Not quickly. and by the family's account, not with any real transparency. Frustrated by the silence, the Wells family paid privately for a second independent autopsy, flown out to Washington, D.C., and represented by attorney Ben Crump, a name true crime audiences will recognize from a string of cases involving black victims and contested official narratives. What came back from that second exam wasn't a cause of death. It was a single, strange detail that nobody has been able to fully explain. A patch of reddish discoloration, deep in the soft tissue at the back of the head, in the area overlying the occipital bone, the base of the skull, where it meets the top of the neck. And once that detail became public, it stopped being a footnote in a medical report and became the center of the entire case. Here's why. To a layperson, discoloration in the back of the head sounds almost clinical, easy to wave off. But sit with it for a moment, the way the pathologists who discussed it publicly did, and it splits into at least 3 separate stories, each of them plausible, none of them provable yet. The first story is the simplest, and the one that requires nothing sinister at all: decomposition. A body left in warm coastal water for 2 days before recovery, and then transported again after the first autopsy, undergoes exactly the kind of tissue breakdown that can produce a reddish discoloration in muscle. Nothing about that requires an injury. It's just what dead tissue does, especially in heat and humidity, and forensic pathologists see it constantly in bodies recovered from water. The second story is lividity, the simple physics of blood settling under gravity once the heart stops pumping it. Wherever a body rests after death, blood pools there. That's normally straightforward to interpret, except this body didn't stay in one position. It was found face down on the beach. It was then transported for the first autopsy, likely placed on its back at some point in that process, and later flown across the country, on its back again, for the second exam. Each of those repositionings can, in theory, cause blood that had already settled to shift or repool somewhere new, which means a redness in exactly the spot you'd expect from lying face up doesn't necessarily tell you anything about how the body was positioned at the moment of death. It might just be telling you about a shipping container. The third story is the one nobody wants to say first, and the one that hangs over the whole case anyway: blunt force trauma. An impact to the back of the head and upper neck, sustained before death, that could, depending on severity and what it did on the way down, plausibly explain why an 18-year-old strong swimmer ended up face down in shallow water a few miles from a crowded beach.
Revealed a 12 by 8 inch focal area of red discoloration in the deep soft tissues overlaying the occipital bone. And he talked about how he found red discoloration when he cut open into the back of his head towards the occipital bone, and he saw the red discoloration, and we actually saw the pictures of it. It's significant. You can't help but notice, why is this dark red here in the back of his head? And so he was important to note that in his report. He said that etiology of this finding is unclear.
The honest, frustrating truth, according to the forensic experts who've weighed in, is that none of these 3 explanations can currently be ruled out, and there's no shortcut to figuring out which one is correct. What you'd actually want to tell trauma apart from decomposition or lividity is visible injury to the surface of the skin above that same spot. Bruising, abrasion, a laceration, anything a decomposing body still shows even days later, because decomposition doesn't erase surface injuries the way it can muddy soft internal tissue. And by every account given publicly so far, no such surface injury has been described. That absence cuts both ways. Read one way, it's reassuring. No visible wound means no obvious blow. Read another way, it's exactly what you'd expect if the injury came from something blunt and broad, rather than something sharp. The kind of impact that bruises deep tissue without necessarily breaking skin. A fall against a boat hull, a wave slamming a body against something submerged, or something else entirely. Nobody examining this case from a distance can tell you which, and neither, apparently, could either of the 2 examiners who's actually held the tissue in their hands. If the red discoloration is the case's first open wound, the second is what wasn't there to examine at all. And this is where the story stops feeling like ordinary forensic ambiguity and starts feeling like something closer to a chain of custody problem. When a body undergoes a first autopsy and a family later arranges a second, independent one, it is apparently common, almost routine, for the original medical examiner's office to retain certain tissues and organs for their own further testing before a body is released. That's the explanation offered for why the second, independent exam in this case never received the internal structures of Nolan's neck, the hyoid bone, the laryngeal cartilage, the small and famously delicate architecture of the throat that a forensic pathologist checks specifically when strangulation needs to be ruled in or out. Said plainly, without any drama attached to it, that's the part of the body most directly relevant to answering the one question everyone actually wants answered, and it simply wasn't available to the doctor the family trusted enough to hire.
With the following questions still outstanding, number one, what were the circumstances that led to Nolan Xavier Wells entering the water? Number two, what was the body position when it was found? We know that a member of the United Cajun Navy said that he was face down and he was fully clothed. Number three, where's there water in the airway? Remember he talked about the lungs and the airways where they fill with water. Number four, is there any evidence of injuries to the anterior neck structure? We got the autopsy without his neck. We got the body without his neck at the time of the second autopsy. Number five, is there any evidence of any intracranial hemorrhaging? He said that is going to be very significant. Things that he could not observe at autopsy that the initial medical examiner would have been able to observe. Number six, what was the composition of the stomach contents? He talks about that being important because when was he found? How long had he been in the water? How long had it been since his last meal? All those things become relevant factors when you're trying to do a thorough and impartial autopsy. And number seven, what are the toxicology report findings?
There are two ways to hold that fact, and honestly, both of them are defensible. The generous read is procedural and mundane. The original examiner kept those structures because they wanted to run their own microscopic tests, cutting thin sections of tissue to look under magnification for hairline fractures in bone that's otherwise too fragile and too small to assess any other way. That's real forensic method, not evasion. A fractured hyoid bone is exactly the kind of finding that requires this level of care, and rushing it would only produce a less reliable answer. Under that read, the missing structures are annoying for a grieving family's timeline, but not evidence of anything being hidden. The less generous read is simpler and darker. That the single piece of anatomy most capable of confirming or ruling out manual strangulation somehow wasn't made available to the outside doctor, the family specifically brought in because they didn't trust the first process. And that whether or not that was intentional, it has the effect of keeping the most important question unanswerable by anyone except the original office. Neither the second autopsy's own notes, by all accounts, mention this material being deliberately reserved for a later joint review between the two offices. It's simply described as absent. Whether that absence gets explained later as ordinary procedure or something else, it currently sits in the case as exactly what it is, an unanswered gap, at precisely the point where an answer matters most. And then there's a third debate running underneath the first two, not about the body at all, but about how the findings were delivered to the public in the first place, and whether that delivery helped or actively hurt everyone trying to understand what happened. The independent autopsy results were announced publicly, read aloud, heavy with technical vocabulary, occipital, decompensation, anterior neck structures, by people who are not themselves forensic pathologists. To some observers, that was exactly the right call. A grieving family distrustful of an official process that had already been slow and opaque, has every right to make its own findings public, rather than wait indefinitely on an office that hasn't explained its own delay. Transparency, even partial and confusing transparency, beats silence. To others, including at least one trial attorney who spent a career sitting across from exactly this kind of evidence, the manner of the announcement was itself the problem. Reading a preliminary, undetermined finding aloud in dense medical language without a lay explanation of what any of it does or doesn't prove doesn't inform an anxious public so much as it hands them fragments and lets them build their own conclusions out of the gaps. That's precisely the mechanism, this argument goes, by which reasonable uncertainty curdles into speculation, and speculation curdles into people treating an unresolved undetermined as if it were a coded confirmation of something specific. Foul play, a cover-up, a strangulation nobody's willing to say out loud, when the actual, honest content of the report is that nobody yet knows anything at all. Both critiques can be true simultaneously, and that might be the most uncomfortable part of this whole thread. The family had every reason not to trust silence, and the public, hungry for resolution in a case that offers none, had every incentive to fill technical uncertainty with narrative certainty of their own, reading undetermined as we can't prove it yet, rather than what it more honestly means, which is closer to we genuinely don't know. A body can carry the physical residue of an accident and the physical residue of foul play and look, on a preliminary report, almost identical. Presented badly, that ambiguity becomes fuel. Presented well, it's still just ambiguity, but at least it's honestly labeled as such. There's also a quieter problem sitting underneath the presentation debate, one that has less to do with any single choice and more to do with the format itself. A preliminary autopsy report is, by design, a snapshot of an unfinished process, a set of observations awaiting toxicology, awaiting further tissue analysis, awaiting a second office's findings to be reconciled with the first. It isn't built to be read aloud to a general audience in real time, sentence by sentence, with cameras rolling and a comment section forming underneath it. Every phrase in that kind of document is written for other forensic professionals who share a vocabulary and a set of assumptions about what an undetermined finding does and doesn't imply. Strip that context away, hand the same paragraph to a room full of people who are frightened, grieving, or simply curious, and the words stop functioning as careful hedges and start functioning as clues in a puzzle nobody assembled correctly. That's not necessarily anyone's fault. It might just be what happens when a private medical document collides with a public appetite for resolution that the document was never written to satisfy. Before we go further, decomposition, lividity, or something else. One word in the comments. Which one are you leaning toward right now, based on everything so far? Hold that answer, because the next thread might change it, and it cuts in an uncomfortable direction for skeptics of the family's approach too. If the criticism is that releasing partial findings invites speculation, the obvious rejoinder is that withholding findings altogether has already produced exactly the same result, for exactly the same case, on the official side. Weeks after the recovery of the body, the original state autopsy still hadn't been made public in any detailed form. Silence didn't prevent conspiracy theories from forming around this case. It simply meant those theories formed around the absence of information instead of the presence of it. Whichever side of that argument you find more persuasive, the practical result has been the same either way, a public left to reason from fragments, official and unofficial alike, toward conclusions that neither office has actually reached yet.
And again, my concern, and also my husband's concern, was it was not even an hour that his body had been removed, and the sheriff came out and said, this is, accidental drowning, we don't think there's foul play. Again, that is why we're doing what we're doing and why we're moving the way we are. Because I sat there and asked them, please take this case as if this is your child, yes, your family member, your whatever. And they promised that they would, but when you make statements like that straight out the gate, that's an issue. We did meet with the DA. She did promise, transparency and all of this, all of that. However, damage has already been done, because now that's the narrative that's being pushed by the general public, who again, know nothing really, only what they're hearing from other people. So in addition to that, it's all these things coming up. And at the end of the day, like I said before, any parent that would be in this situation, you would do anything to find out what happened to your child.
Running alongside the medical uncertainty is a set of much more mundane, much harder to dismiss threads, the kind that don't require any forensic expertise to sit with, just plain attention. The first is the phone. By all accounts, Nolan was an active poster, the kind of teenager whose social media tells you where he was and what he was doing almost in real time. On July 4th, that stopped. No Snapchat stories, no posts, nothing from the moment the boat left him behind. His mother, hearing about this gap, initially raised the possibility that something had been deleted. The more mundane explanation, offered by people who actually know the island, is that cell signal on Horn Island is famously unreliable, and Snapchat simply doesn't upload without one. It's possible nothing sinister happened to his phone at all. It's possible he just couldn't post. But possible is doing a lot of work in a story like this, and the family's unease about a 15-minute delay in getting the phone handed back to them, a small, human, arguably meaningless 15 minutes, became, in the retelling, another thread in a pattern that either means everything or means nothing.
The fact that they're saying Nolan said that he would stay behind, but yet an 18-year-old kid would not want his cell phone if he was going to stay behind. The fact that, you have the young lady saying that he said he was going to get back on the boat with the boys, and then the boys saying no, he said he was going to stay behind and talk to her. If that was the case, don't you believe Nolan would have said, give me my cell phone, I'm gonna stay behind. Give me my car keys, I'm gonna stay behind. It's not adding up. And so we're gonna keep fighting and digging until we get the answers, the transparency, the truth, the accountability, and justice for Nolan Wells.
A digital forensics review, if one is ever fully conducted and disclosed, could settle this cleanly. Deleted data leaves a trace, even when the deletion itself is invisible to a casual glance. Until that review is public, the gap in his online activity remains exactly what it looks like from the outside, either an entirely explainable dead zone or a silence that someone chose. Then there's the boat itself, which has its own timeline and its own strange gaps. It left the original dock in the mid-morning, arrived at the island a little over an hour later, sometime in the afternoon, after Nolan had already been left behind. According to the group's account, there's a call placed to boating rescue services, reporting the vessel taking on water, asking for help. When asked directly whether everyone aboard is safe, the answer given is yes, everyone's fine, everyone's on board. It's a small, easily explained moment in isolation. But the boat's own GPS history complicates it. After that call, the vessel is taken under tow for a few miles, then released. From there, instead of heading straight back to be hauled out, which is what you'd expect from a boat serious enough about its own flooding to call for a tow in the first place, it instead makes a string of additional stops, back to the original dock, out again to a separate location on the water, back to the original dock a second time. Somewhere in that sequence there's a gap of over an hour where the boat simply sits, docked, not moving, before it eventually goes out once more and is finally pulled from the water and loaded onto a trailer that evening. A boat reportedly taking on water that afternoon spends much of the rest of the day and evening still moving under its own power, making stops that have nothing obviously to do with an emergency repair. There are entirely mundane ways to read that sequence. Boats spring small leaks that get temporarily managed rather than fixed immediately. People finish out a day already in motion rather than abandon plans over a problem that seems handled. A distress call from a nervous 18-year-old, phrased urgently in the moment, might describe a problem that turned out, on inspection, to be far less serious than it sounded. Maybe the sinking framing got lost in translation, somewhere between a scared phone call and the way it was later described by others. Or maybe the timeline is hiding something nobody's explained yet. A series of trips that had a purpose nobody's accounted for publicly, made it exactly the hours when the one person who could contradict the group's account was still missing. Nobody involved has said, on the record, which one it is, and the raw GPS logs, whatever they ultimately show, haven't been laid out publicly with a clear explanation attached to each stop. What's not in dispute is what happened after. The friends who were on that island, by every account, went quiet. Social media accounts were deleted or locked down. Legal representation was retained before authorities finished their interviews. None of that, on its own, means guilt. Teenagers close ranks under pressure for all kinds of reasons, including the simple terror of being blamed for something they had no part in. But grief and fear both tend to keep people talking to family, to community, to anyone who will listen. Silence, chosen deliberately and maintained this long, tends to read as something else, even when it isn't. Running under all of it is the question nobody in this case can avoid, whether they want to talk about it directly or not. The photographs from that day show Nolan, black, 18, a promising athlete, surrounded almost entirely by white friends, on a stretch of the Mississippi coast with a long and difficult racial history. That context doesn't prove anything happened to him because of who he was. It also doesn't make the question go away. The NAACP's national leadership has been careful on this point, urging a complete investigation before anyone commits to an explanation in either direction, neither assuming the worst nor waving it away as coincidence. That's a harder position to hold than either extreme, and it's probably the correct one. There's a version of this story where every single thread resolves into something ordinary. The discoloration is decomposition, made stranger-looking by 2 transports and a cross-country flight. The neck structures are sitting, right now, under a microscope somewhere, waiting on results that will eventually be shared between both offices. The boat really did spring a minor leak, got patched, and kept running errands that had nothing to do with anyone's disappearance. The missing Snapchat posts are just a dead zone on a remote island that gets bad signal on a good day. The friends went quiet because they're 18 and terrified and badly advised, not because they have anything to hide. And a healthy young athlete, alone on an unfamiliar stretch of coastline as the tide changed, made one bad decision in open water that nobody could have prevented and no one will ever fully explain, because that's simply how some drownings happen, quietly, without witnesses, without a villain. Coastal drownings involving strong swimmers happen more often than most people assume, usually for reasons that have nothing to do with anyone's intent. A rip current, a sudden cramp, a head injury from something submerged and invisible, fatigue nobody was watching closely enough to notice. If this case ends there, it won't be the first time a tragedy this painful turned out to have no villain in it at all. Only bad luck and a young man alone at the wrong moment. There's another version where one or more of those threads doesn't resolve so cleanly, where the reddish discoloration turns out, once the neck structures are finally examined, to sit alongside something else. A fracture, an injury, a finding that reframes everything that came before it, where the boat's stalled hour and the missing Snapchat window turn out to matter after all, where he told us he was staying behind turns out to be the truth, or turns out to be the first thread someone pulled to build a story that made everyone else look blameless. In that version, everything documented here stops being a collection of coincidences and becomes, in hindsight, a pattern that was visible the whole time to anyone willing to add it up, the same way it often looks, after the fact, in cases that took months or years to finally resolve. The honest position, uncomfortable as it is that nothing available right now lets an outside observer tell those 2 versions apart. That's not a failure of curiosity or attention. Dozens of journalists, forensic professionals, and amateur sleuths alike have gone through every available document and photograph and GPS timestamp in this case, and none of them have been able to close that gap either. It's simply what an unresolved case looks like from the outside, before the toxicology, before the reconciled autopsy findings, before anyone with actual access to the evidence says anything more definite than undetermined. Right now, nobody outside that investigation, not the medical examiners, not the sheriff's office, not the family's attorney, not the reporters who've spent weeks pulling at GPS logs and social media timestamps, actually knows which of those 2 stories is true. Now that you've heard the discoloration, the missing throat structures, the boat, and the phone, has your answer from earlier changed? Accident, or does something here still not add up for you? Let us know before we get to where this stands right now. That's not a satisfying place to end a piece like this, but it is the only honest one available. Until the toxicology results are released, until somebody accounts publicly for the boat's stalled hour on the water, until somebody explains where those neck structures are and what they eventually show, this case is going to keep occupying that uncomfortable space between accident and something worse. Not because anyone involved has necessarily done anything wrong, but because nobody has yet been able to prove that they haven't. His mother put it simply, in the middle of everything else that's been said, that she and her family are leaning on their faith and on each other, and that it's been heartbreaking to have the first, independent results in hand and hear nothing yet from the people who are supposed to have the real answers. Right now, that's the truest sentence in the entire case. Everyone, the family, the reporters, the pathologists reading the same paragraph 3 different ways, and everyone who's followed this story since the 4th of July, is still waiting to hear what actually happened to Nolan Wells.